Hello, my name is Chelsea Wayne. I am a part of the rehabilitation of serial killers, and my portion in the research paper was at the legitimate treatment portion. There are two different types of treatment. There are therapeutic treatment for more social situations, more learning right and wrong, and then there's also the medical treatment aspect of psychopathy, which is more diseases and dealing with mental disorders, a lot more medication. So one of them has to deal with a lot of psychiatry, and then the other one is psychology. So at the beginning, it was relatively easy to end up delving into this topic, especially since it's a highly debated topic. There's a lot of yeses, there's a lot of no's, whether serial killers should be rehabilitated in general. So there were a lot of rejected sources, obviously, and some of the rejected sources had to deal with just being from anonymous people that decided to put their opinions out. And that's what this first topic is here on the PowerPoint. The very first one is just from an anonymous person. Ended up writing an entire book, and this book ended up talking about profiling violent behaviors. And this could end up helping in my research paper some of this information, because when you look at treatment, the important aspects is warning signs. So finding warning signs, catching them early on, and how to deal with those warning signs can be a form of treatment. But without anything from this author, it's really hard to end up using this resource. And for the second one, it ends up talking, it's just an article, it talks about the confinement of psychopaths and with the law, how the law actually ends up dealing with them and what they do after they're already in prison, which is definitely not what we're looking for. We are looking for something that has to deal with rehabilitating them instead of just keeping them out of society forever. And one of the resources I delved into a little bit was that anonymous resource. And it had some legitimately good information that I really wanted to use in my paper. But there was absolutely no author name. The author gave no credentials of how they even knew the information in the book. And it ended up going into profiling behavior. So it was a really good starting point, but there was no finishing cusp. There was no finale. There was no, yes, we profile these behaviors, now what are we going to do with it? And since there was no author name, no credentials, and I almost didn't feel finished, there was no peer review on it. So I didn't trust the information enough. But I ended up reading through it nonetheless and seeing where I can end up using that as a bouncing off point to some of my accepted resources that will end up being next. So some of the accepted ones, there is an article, it is a lot of scientific research. Every single one of these are peer reviewed to start off, right off the bat. Every one of them is peer reviewed, and they have a lot more either statistics or scientific research. It ended up taking them years to write these papers, which gives them automatically more credentials, especially since most of them end up having their PhD or their doctorate. And those are the things, especially with treatment options, especially with the medical aspect of my paper. I'm looking for all of the treatment aspects. So with the medication, with the psychopathy, and with dealing with those mental disorders, people have to know about the mental disorders to end up treating them. So opinions are not in these papers. And even if they are a little bit biased, they have numbers and they have legitimate research to back it up. And one of these papers I ended up delving into a lot. It was absolutely beautiful, especially when it ends up looking into just information literacy. For this paper, this doctor and his entire team, they ended up looking into psychopaths, and it was made in 2011, which means it was relatively recent. It was in the past decade. It is highly peer-reviewed. A lot of people end up reading this paper, and a lot of people have cited it in their own papers as well. And there are a lot of different components to this paper. It feels very finished. It feels like not only one person ended up putting a little bit of time into it, it was the entire paper itself. It goes from history and ends up going into the diseases, the different mental disorders, how those end up dealing with nature versus nurture, and how medication or therapy can end up dealing with either of these symptoms. And most of the time, this paper doesn't only deal with a yes or no kind of answer. It deals with a yes, for these symptoms, you can use this treatment, and for these symptoms, you can use this treatment. And what the overall effect of rehabilitating serial killers even would be about, and what that would end up doing to society in a whole. Will it end up benefiting? Would it end up dropping it down? When it ends up dealing with the effects, it does go into a little bit of opinion, just because they're making more of a guess, because it has not happened yet, but it is based on all of the estimations from the past. So for my statistical figures, I apologize about the horn. For my statistical figures, it is actually from that last paper that I ended up accepting. These statistical figures are very important in my research, simply because it looks at how an individual specifically would end up rating on the hair test, which is just a psychopathy test that they end up using in prisons and in different situations with treatment. So on a low psychopathy, on this figure, you can see that as time goes on, they can legitimately stay out of prison. But the higher the psychopathy, the more chance it is that they will just end up going back in prison afterwards. And this just shows how the flow of prisoners is broken, because there is no fixing them and keeping them out of this situation. It's just keeping them reincarcerated over and over. And I ended up choosing this graph due to the different statistics, due to the different research, and it is such a huge amount of prisoners. It is 231 prisoners that ended up being used for this one graph. So it's not only that it is 3 lines on a piece of paper, this is years of research just shown in one graph. So for my methodology, this did not come out pretty at all. For my methodology, I ended up looking for a lot of keywords. I looked for medical treatment in general, and after I ended up looking for the treatment, that ended up giving me a lot of different variables that I would have had to look for. So after that, I looked for statistics in with psychopathy. So I looked for how many prisoners, I looked for how many prisoners ended up having different diseases, etc. And after that, I wanted to get even more of a broad idea. I ended up looking at summary articles, because I didn't end up getting all of those pieces I wanted. I wanted the disease, I wanted the history, and I wanted the treatment and effects. So since I was in the treatment and effects, I needed the whole picture, which is why I looked at summary articles, and then I ended up picking from those summary articles and I looked at individual information. So summary articles ended up being the best for me, just because on my portion, I ended up picking from the summary articles, and I ended up looking for the original work. And as long as the original work was peer-reviewed and met all of my criteria for using the information, I used that information instead. So it just was a funnel effect. And this is just my biography. I am a senior at Old Dominion University, and I have my double major, or I'm going to have my double major, one in education and one in biology. I happen to really like this topic because it does have such a gray zone, and it's very highly debated. And here is my bibliography, everything in APA format. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.